sort of in these old recordings I found talked about Texas's, long history of frontier justice. This idea that if the state doesn't execute people, groups of vigilantes are just going to go string people up. And there's a lot of references to, barroom fights and the just sort of predilection for violence among Texans. Not a lot of data to back that up. Violent crime was not, higher here than it was anywhere else. But there was a sort of image of like John Wayne movies that you would see in the political conversation back then. And you still see it today in certain instances. I certainly heard it when I was researching for the book. But there's sort of another narrative out there, and this is the narrative of lynchings, right? Texas, like many other southern states, had, hundreds and hundreds of illegal mob killings, essentially, of primarily black men in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And there's a handful of lawyers in Texas who have really done a lot of the work to try to raise that story up and connect the dots between those illegal lynchings and the sort of legal executions that followed. Many listeners might be familiar with Brian Stevenson in Alabama, who's a sort of famous figure in terms of making this argument. But in Texas, Craig Washington, who was a member of the legislature in the 70s, and then Dana Lynn Reeser, who's a defense lawyer who is still active and working, were both sort of very leading figures in trying to, from a scholarly perspective and then from a kind of political perspective, connect the dots and explain how, sure, lynchings were illegal and executions are legal, but the line between them can get very fuzzy. One story that was really compelling to me in the book is that there was a man named Dick Garrett who was executed in the first decade of the 20th century, and he was put on trial, and it was a legal trial. Technically, his constitutional rights were not violated. It was a 4-hour-long trial over whether he was going to get the death penalty for committing murder. And while he was in the courtroom, he could hear the sound of saws and hammers outside because they were already building the scaffold, because the sort of outcome of this trial was a sort of foregone conclusion. And that was an example that Reeser brought up in her own writing, and that I point to as evidence of how thin that line can be between the lynchings, that we think of as the past, and the executions that the state came to carry out throughout the 20th century.
There's a couple of things I just want to dig in a little bit more on. That these lynchings, of course, took place sort of like as a way of ending Reconstruction, mm-hmm. and bringing in this new era of blowback or pushback or of new white supremacy that we have talked about on this program quite a bit. The rise of the KKK in that era, and starting to put up all the statues of Southern, generals and Confederate war heroes, as it were. But this idea that the state lawmakers in Texas were justifying executions as a way of preempting lynchings. Can you talk about that a little bit more in that the fuzziness? I mean, I can see the sort of the metaphor there with you can hear them building the gallows before the verdict comes. Like, this is a foregone conclusion. We're just now adding in a layer of sort of respectability to this lynching. Where else, like what other elements of this, center around it? Is it race? Is it the way that they publicize and demonize? Is it, what are the other elements that sort of satiate, I guess? What is being satiated?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I mean, and I should say it's not just Texas legislators. There were members of the Supreme Court who also said, if we don't have the death penalty, we're going to risk having, illegal vigilante justice and mob killings of people. And again, there was sort of no real evidence to back that up, but it's the argument that these, members of the Supreme Court made. I think that in Texas, there's been a sort of particular cultural story about what's getting satiated in terms of justice that gets told that kind of clouds the picture. And so, while lynchings in Alabama and Georgia and Florida were primarily associated with race historically, in Texas, they also primarily fell upon, black men, and often after accusations of, having sex with a white woman. It's a very common thing that would happen in Texas just as much as the other southern states. But when Texans talk about lynching, they have a different image in mind. They have a kind of, like I said before, John Wayne movie of, stringing up the cattle rustler, right? The sort of white cowboys going after the guy. And yes, it's dirty. Yes, it's unfortunate. It's kind of a regrettable necessity of the frontier. There was a famous television ad in the 90s for Pace Salsa where they find out they're eating, these cowboys find out they're eating salsa that was made in New York, and they look at the chef and they say, "Get a rope." And there's just this very flip attitude towards lynchings, born of the idea that they're a kind of nostalgic relic of the frontier rather than a tool of, maintaining a racial caste order in the wake of the Civil War, and in the founding of Texas, which we, as historians and scholars and journalists know that's the history. But there's this kind of cultural story that it's really just about punishing, white cowboys, right? That gets told that I think, allows race to get subsumed. And then over the course of the 80s and 90s, I read dozens of trial transcripts, and you see that race gets subsumed even further. So they never say, that black man is going to go, and if we don't execute him, he's going to go and rape and kill more people. They say, these monsters roaming the streets, we're not safe in our beds at night because those people are running around, killing innocent Americans. And they don't say race, they don't say black people, but you can start to read it between the lines. And it's the same era in which, crime and a fear of crime becomes a kind of coded way of talking about race in politics, right? Under Nixon and Reagan. So this is just a part of the bigger story.
And Maurice, just connecting it back to Texas as well, because I think it being so central to what you wrote about is just key. How Rick Perry and other politicians coming out of Texas use the carrying out of executions and like record breaking. I mean, I remember Rick Perry on the debate stage bragging about how many people he would execute. And I know you wrote about that as well, how he broke records. How that's still so integral to the politics of that state now, and how it's like hard for some northern people like myself to understand, but how all of that history culminates in the politics of the state even today.
It's true. And there's a great anthropologist who wrote like a PhD dissertation that I read in which she interviewed all these people who had served on juries in Texas and sentenced people to death. And they never say they themselves have these cultural ideas, but they say, oh yeah, where I'm from in whatever town, people just want to string them up. Like there's this sort of idea that we all believe this as Texans. I found in the research a lot of sort of just cultural references that go beyond the debate stage, the comedian Ron White making flip jokes about executions, or, on SNL or The Simpsons. It's this idea that Texas is the epicenter of the death penalty and executions, and that it comes from this old cowboy culture. I think there have been moments where, running for president, George W. Bush or Rick Perry have confronted some questions and, antagonism from people, for whom the death penalty is a relic, people, confronting them on the debate stage in other states, in Iowa or New York. But in Texas, it's a selling point still politically and culturally. I do think that's starting to change. I mean, a lot of our bigger cities, not just Austin, but Houston and Dallas, have become more diverse. You have district attorneys running for office in these counties that are saying, we're not going to seek the death penalty as often anymore. And they have, again, more diverse and sort of democratic leaning voter bases in those big cities. So I do think you're seeing things start to turn the corner in line with the larger kind of cultural shift in Texas that, again, I'm not one of those people who think Texas is going to turn blue tomorrow, but you can see the signs of change.
I don't want to get too hung up on the Texas thing, but I'm really fascinated by this, and I'm fascinated by the sort of the myths that we have, not just this, but things like the lost cause and whatnot, that we build to hide sort of the underlying realities. And I grew up on a lot of Westerns as a kid. And I keep thinking about Hang 'em High, which is that Clint Eastwood movie about hanging. And so much of it was about, we can't get the guy back to, we're too far away to the central, the one jail that we have. So we're going to have to hang him here because I'm not going to be able to bring this guy back alive. And that whole notion of like, overtaxed, and not overtaxed, but overmatched lawmen and, their inability to bring people to justice, and they got to do it right there because otherwise this guy's going to go free. I mean, that whole sort of mythos in some respects feels like it was developed. You have this massive expanse of space, and so you could develop this myth on some level, but it really probably was just covering up for a certain amount of viciousness, and then ultimately sort of to hide this sort of racial component of the story.
Yeah, another example I often bring up for people is the Alamo, which is like the sort of foundational myth of Texas that many Americans have heard about, and we, growing up in Texas, hear the story about the sort of celebratory, that they lost at the Alamo, but then they got victory, not long after that. But many of these sort of foundational figures in Texas history held these same very pernicious views of race and slavery. They were very afraid of, freed slaves taking over Texas, and they developed these myths to try to kind of cloud the picture for people and give them not necessarily a bloodlust support for the death penalty, but this idea that you're describing. It's almost like with a sigh, oh, it's a regrettable necessity. It's too bad we have to have it, but we're too far from the courthouse and the jail, so let's just do it. And of course, that's couldn't be further from the truth today, but these ideas still circulate with a fair amount of nostalgia.
And we should also mention, we mentioned Rick Perry, but Bill Clinton, sort of to project, and we could probably talk for hours on what the theory was amongst his campaign, because he was dealing with the idea that he was a draft dodger and this and that, needed to project some measure of strength, I guess. But he ordered the execution of Ricky Rector, I think his name was, who was an African-American man who I can't remember the specifics, but had a particularly low IQ. Tell us just more about that story and how that plays into this.
Sure, absolutely. So I think the political context that's worth noting there is that the death penalty became a kind of culture war issue and a political touchstone in the 80s and 90s. Many people remember the Willie Horton ad where Dukakis, was accused of letting a man out to rape and kill. But Dukakis also faced questions on the debate stage about what would happen if his wife was raped and murdered. Would he support the death penalty? And the fact that he seemed weak on that issue to voters was really unhelpful for him. And so, 4 years later, Bill Clinton is running for president. He gets a lot of accusations that he's liberal and wishy-washy and needs to project an image of toughness. And he flies home from the campaign trail to preside over an execution of this man, Ricky Rector. Ricky Rector was African-American, and he had actually suffered brain damage, I think, from a bullet that hit him in the head when he killed a police officer. And so he was psychologically, very diminished and did not really understand what his execution was about. The famous anecdote that I find very chilling from that is that he had a last meal, and at the end of the last meal was a piece of pie, and he said, I'm going to store that and put it in the fridge and eat it later. And didn't really understand that it was his own last meal. And Bill Clinton got a lot of flack for that on the left. And I've even seen people on the right who support the death penalty, bring that up as an example of his particular callousness. I think a lot of political leaders today regret how they use the death penalty in ways that look very callous to our modern eyes. I mean, one of them is President Biden, right? In the Senate in the early 90s, he was touting a bill and he said, in this bill, it's great. We do everything but hang people for jaywalking. And again, with the word hang kind of evokes this sort of old mythology. Now Biden says that he opposes the death penalty, but he's sort of not alone. There's been a whole sea change, I think, in the Democratic Party where they've come to see that the punishment is problematic. And there's a question of sort of going forward, how much of a priority they make it and how much they try to bring the right along.
Well, there's like this, after effect from all of the law and order push by the Republican Party, Nixon, Reagan, like that was so central to those campaigns. And then you talk about the after effects in the 90s of Timothy McVeigh and how that kind of allowed for the public to stomach the notion of a death penalty. But what's so saddening about that is obviously he was an outlier, a massive outlier, because a lot of this affects poorer people and traditionally Black people as well. So can you talk about that moment as how it punctuated this conversation or
Sure.
pushed it forward?
Absolutely. So in the early 90s, there was a series of bills